Yo, what is going on, everyone? Today we have a special guest. We're going to be going deep into tokenization. We're going to learn about XDC. We actually have one of the developers, part of the XDC Foundation, and I'm really excited because we actually hung out and we met together in at XRP Vegas. So let me get if you see right here, you can see me and Quincy on stage together. So this is Quincy's X account. I always say Twitter. I'm still so programmed
I
to
know,
say
right? It's
Twitter.
just so ingrained, like you just automatically hit the Twitter.
I'll always just immediately say Twitter, but he is the lead developer and dev relations of XDC Foundation. Super awesome mind. A lot of people in the XRP community also are familiar with Quincy. So everyone, welcome Quincy to the show. How's it going, man? How has things been since XRP Vegas?
It's been kind of crazy actually. Cool. Really appreciate you having me on here. Yeah, just been a lot going on. Definitely a lot going on in tokenization. A lot going on in sort of like new startups, funding. A lot of new projects coming into the space. Not just XDC, but I see a lot of XDC projects, but a lot of projects coming into the space. And just a lot of growth. It's been really interesting. Especially just since Vegas a couple weeks back.
So how long, like when did your journey start in Web3? Like how did can you paint us a picture of how it all began?
Yeah, it's actually a really funny story. Before I got involved in any crypto whatsoever, I was working at a private equity firm, and I was a developer, primarily focusing on two projects. One was focusing on a tech transfer from an on-prem system to the cloud. On lending to small businesses. So they had this system that they built like 20 years ago, and they were trying to create a migration into the cloud, and I was mostly there to focus on that. But the other side of their business was focusing on startups, and they owned a piece of an accelerator really close to the college that I went to at the time. That was constantly filtering through new startups. So we would see social media startups, we'd see different logistics startups, different apps, the classic startup space. Like, you ever seen the show like Silicon Valley, where just all these different people, all these different apps, just like a constant, even in the crypto space, you can sort of feel it like that, just a constant space of people and their projects. So at the time, I was just sort of like this back end cloud developer, primarily like really either focusing on one of their major projects or sort of like going through this like filter process of a lot of the startups that they saw. And really what they did were they would primarily collaborate with the university. This was Arizona State, professors, different or different startups that emerged out of the university, because they had an accelerator at the university. There was sort of like it was sort of like an ecosystem in a sense. We were constantly engaging in this ecosystem, and at the time, I had nothing to do with crypto really. There was just a component where we were just in the startup space, evaluating all these different projects, going over how their models work, going over how their tech works, seeing if they're worth going through their program. And then right around mid 2017, things started to get a little weird, right? So we would start seeing these startups. And in prior, we would see a startup, let's say, had 10,000, 20,000 users. It's been around for like a year or two. Maybe it'd be like a dating app or something generic, right? And these apps were basically worthless, but they had a user base, they had a basic use case. We started seeing startups that were basically these white paper ICOs, basically raising tens of millions of dollars, and they were just either a white paper or a token or whatever. So it very much like caught our attention, where we're like, holy cow, like we see all these apps, and all of a sudden this like wave of crypto apps pop up, and they're getting all this funding, and there's ICOs and NFTs and all this. And it sort of like popped up on the radar because it's sort of just like crypto space, crypto apps. It just sort of popped up on the radar for startups. So at the time, we really dove in on Bitcoin and Ethereum. Bitcoin being just, everyone sort of getting into crypto through Bitcoin. And then Ethereum, basically due to the idea of what we can do with the apps that can be built on Ethereum. Because it was like, there was this idea of like, yeah, there's crypto, there's the token, but what are startups that are building new models on these new networks? So we were focusing on Ethereum, smart contracts, new ICOs. It was just, the whole works at the time, right? And for a while, I almost made like this huge pivot from like back-end cloud development and lending to crypto, and like almost like evaluating these new crypto applications that would come through. And every month we would just have like a new, like almost like a new cohort of applications come through, maybe like 2 or 3 apps. We'd evaluate them, we'd check out their team, we'd check out how much they built, what they've done. And crypto at the time, most apps made sense. It'd be like, well, we have our users, they do this, they do that. Crypto is almost like it was like so like beyond real for a bit. We would have like these granular ideas, like people are saying that they're going to completely topple the financial markets, they're going to completely topple the bond markets. Very big vision. And it's really hard to track because at the time crypto was very new. So I spent maybe about a year. I was at the firm for about 3 years, but I spent maybe about a year just diving into nothing but crypto. And we ended up going through all the different networks. We ended up going through Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP. We ended up going through Solana, Arbitrum, XDC. We started going through all these different networks at the time. This was like as time was going on, because this was going till like maybe 2020, 2021. Just things were going on for a while. And we settled on Corda at the time. So they didn't want to take on the risk of a particular crypto asset. So there was this idea of like what type of new blockchain distributed ledger technologies are available that are compatible with other technologies that can sort of like get their like feet wet. And we started onboarding a good portion of like really Corda technology to sort of take our lending platform and really just go from what we were trying to do with. It was sort of like an experimental process, but the main dig was there was a relationship between the underwriter, the person that's filling out the application, and since they're a small business filling out a loan for some equipment, there'd be the vendor that's issuing the equipment. We sort of went into this process of how can we sort of automate that all together, utilizing sort of like distributed ledger technologies. How can we automate that entire process together where the underwriter is able to sign off on the loan, the vendors able to sign off on, they're able to get the loan and issue the equipment. The application can be evaluated from the person that filed the application, the business owner, and then have that whole process sort of be streamlined, because their old traditional way would take weeks. It'd be they call up the applicant on the phone, they get the information, they call up the underwriter, they get that information, they call up the vendor, call up the underwriter. It was really slow. So there was this idea of how can we utilize this new technology to streamline their lending process. And that really dove me into the sort of like the general notion of like what crypto is all about, but also just sort of like that financial notion of like how are people building apps, how are people getting into sort of like real world use cases, because at the time like no one at the firm really took it seriously outside of like the potential for the apps, because like you see apps that are now worth tens of millions of dollars that simply had a white paper or a couple of tokens in a community. So there's just like this huge idea of what's going on with the apps. But when I first dove into it, I didn't necessarily dive directly into the tokens. So I sort of ended up having this perspective that's sort of like this fintech finance perspective on what type of apps are valuable and what type of value do they provide to these ecosystems, and then sort of brought that into my space, into the ecosystem. And then really the thing that sort of blew me into software crypto into crypto Twitter, I ended up going on a YouTuber's YouTube channel. So, classic crypto, right? You get into crypto, you check out Twitter, you check out YouTube, you see all the YouTubers, everyone's dropping videos. And one day, they were talking about Corda, because we at the time at the firm, we were really diving into Corda. I was reading documentation every day, going really into it. And they were talking about Corda, and they're like, "Oh, R3 Corda, blockchain technology." They're talking about Corda Settler and XRP and being able to like integrate with different networks. And I made a comment basically saying, "Hey, I'm actually a developer. I work in fintech, but I work with the Corda platform. I have a pretty good like basis for sort of like what's going on, what are different applications people are building." And the thing is like I went on there and basically just sort of like articulated like my experience with Corda. So yeah, this goes into XDC and Corda's relationship. Actually, to sort of go into it, XDC was one of the first assets listed to be able to be participated in Corda Settler, which also goes into some of my first introductions to Corda, because XRP, XDC, this all tied into Corda's capabilities, because Corda was, or one of the first technologies Corda can interoperate with was XRP and XDC.
That,
But yeah, so I
I
go on.
want to say that one thing. I watched that YouTube video, and then I remember like after that, you're like on a world rock star tour. You're on like everybody's YouTube channel for like a
Yeah,
couple months
yeah, it
after. You're
blew
like,
up after that.
yeah, you were
It
on
went,
that, and like 'cause everyone had all this speculation, and then you like broke down like, let me teach you guys the inner workings of this stuff, and like everyone was like, this was like 2021, 2022,
yeah,
I think.
yeah.
You started on his channel, and then it went boom, 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 boom. I just wanted to say that, yeah.
No, it was yeah, it definitely and that's the thing, I had no idea of like the crypto culture at the time. I spent like a year literally just like in the back office, literally like reading Corda documentation, reading white papers, like Ethereum, Bitcoin, XRP. And literally I never like really went out like in terms of like the crypto culture. So yeah, after that like blew up, I like ended up going on who was it? It was like Brad Kimes, digital asset investor, uh Darren or crypto Darren, and just a bunch of different sort of like crypto influencers, really just showing like my perspective. Like, look, I work in fintech, work in private equity. We're focused on lending. At first they were focusing on Ethereum, but then because of the Ethereum gas fees, they didn't really want to take on Ethereum. So that's why we moved over to. Actually, funny enough, we did move over to XRP, but at the time is when the this was right when the lawsuit hit, and then they were like, yeah, no, I don't know about that. So that's why we settled on Corda, just without having to deal with the nuisance of a token. But the big deal was how can you utilize this technology to be able to create a additional layer of productivity or efficiency with what we were already doing. We were already focusing on lending and already focusing on lending to these small businesses. There was just this idea of how can we incorporate a lot of these new crypto models into being able to automate that. And that's sort of like really because that everything at the time was just experimental. There was no right or wrong way to do anything. They just grabbed like the four of us, like the small little like dev team in the back, and they're like, we're gonna spend the next like at the time they said we're going to spend the next month on crypto. We ended up spending the next like basically until I ended up leaving there on crypto. But it was just one of those things where it's just like, yeah, it's a new thing. And we used to do this all the time when it was a startup. I remember there were times where we would like hop into a startup and work on a startup for like a month, and then either it'd go well with the accelerator and maybe it doesn't, and then we work on another startup that's in their accelerator for a month. So at the time we didn't think it'd be a big thing, but it ended up just sort of blowing up into this bigger and bigger thing of like the potentiality of what the technology is capable of.
So when did you officially like get recruited? Like, did you get recruited, or did you send in an application to XDC? Like, when did you join the XDC Foundation?
Yeah, so when I was going viral, everything was sort of going crazy at the time. So when I went viral, I was sort of getting like recruited by a bunch of different crypto projects. Ripple being like the big one actually at the time. I ended up doing I don't even know what to call it. It was like a interview with them. It was like a live stream interview on Twitch with them on an SDK I wrote in Python for XRP. But I was getting reached out from just like a bunch of different projects, and I ended up like talking to Ripple, ended up doing their Twitch stream, ended up talking to them, and then getting invited to their first Apex. So that was super cool. That's how I got invited to Apex. But sort of in that frenzy of just getting reached out by Ripple, XDC, there were a bunch of other like smaller like crypto projects that weren't really as big. That were just sort of like, oh, cool, are you in the crypto space? And I ended up settling a bit with XDC, partially because at the time XDC was a bit more niche and it was sort of like blowing up. Like it sounds weird to say this, but like XDC was like virtually like non-existent at the time. It was like under a penny type of deal. But it
Yeah,
was one of those things where, yeah,
that
yeah,
was one
it
of
was
my
one of those things
first
where,
big wins in crypto, bro. When I made like a crazy amount of gains, because yeah, I had a saying XDC brings ecstasy because I got it when it was like 0.0000000, and it went all the way to like 20 cents. Freaking
yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
But it was
it was
blowing
definitely,
up because it was like ISO 20022, and like it was like the hidden gem of that
and
cycle. Yeah.
that's why I followed it. I sort of looked at it as like the same as XRP and where Ripple was. I just felt like Ripple and XRP was just further along, You know what I mean? So I was like, oh shoot, I sort of missed the boat on Ripple. Like, could I sort of like get in with like Zinfin, XRP, or XDC, and sort of like really sort of like ride that a bit? And really at the time, like I ended up meeting the team, and the team was super cool. They were setting up the foundation, so everything was super new. I got a lot of freedom at the time, so it was one of those things where I'm like, I could sort of either be like I could either get a good gig at Ripple or sort of have like my own sort of freedom with XDC. So I sort of went with XDC at the time, and obviously like things were kind of like really cool. But I just got approached by so many different projects. I ended up just settling with XDC because I saw everywhere I saw XRP, I saw XDC. So I was like, oh, it's just one of those things where I feel like it just hasn't caught up in terms of like just attention. Like I said, like Ripple's a big company, so I didn't think that. I thought like whether it's Zinfin or any other companies on XDC, they would become a big company and people would start seeing them. And that's starting to become the case too. But yeah, just at the time, I was just getting pursued by so many different projects. Every time I saw XRP, every time I saw XDC, I always saw like really cool, like big stuff. So I kind of thought like, ooh, can I sort of make a play here to potentially like find a cool position and be able to find like a really cool niche in crypto to sort of like
I
sort of
remember
blow up.
that they called them like the three X coins, or like XRP, XLM, and XDC would always get like put together. But as a developer, was it also attractive the fact that XDC had smart contracts?
Yeah, so the cool thing about XDC, so I actually really at the like way originally really liked XRP outside of the fact that it didn't have smart contracts. Now people always would like defer to Ethereum, but obviously there's like Ethereum gas fees. But the real thing that kind of became an issue was I liked XRP for sort of the potential of the market that it can facilitate. And what happened with Ethereum is so focused on sort of like retail speculative ICOs at the time. I wasn't focused on like the speculative retail market. I was focused more on like I said, automation of lending or finance instruments. So I liked XDC because I like the idea that not only can you have this like level of stability and just like the general and the fees, but the ecosystem was generally built around being able to facilitate these needs. So I didn't think I could go to like Ethereum and find like a legitimate lender. Not that people on Ethereum aren't legitimate, but like a very foundational type lender to be able to engage with more foundational type like clientele in a sense. Where I feel like if you build on XDC, you can build an application that's a lending application that can actually be like pushed forward towards these more like these more enterprise toward type companies. And that's the thing. I just worked in fintech, so at the time I was like, I know for a fact that fintech doesn't care about retail. Like, there's a specific way to go about retail that they didn't really care about. There's just this real idea of one being able to expand your total amount of trade partners on chain. That's what I really liked about XRP because people were really talking about cross border remittances, but also with XDC because there's this element of being able to tokenize assets and being able to being able to settle and being able to automate, not even just automate, but being able to automate lending, collateralization, tokenization, and fractionalization, right? You can add all these different components in the smart contracts. But then that just adds on to the layers of trade that can be facilitated with that. So that's what really got me with XDC. I felt like it had the environment XRP had, where it had an environment of people actively trying to engage in these trade instruments, but also had the smart contracts like Ethereum. So we can get into these different layers of tokenization. We can get into fractionalization, collateralization, lending, all these different smart contracts features, and sort of be able to build on top of that to build like really just build interesting and sort of like scalable applications. Now it's
Right.
like the big thing is like, what are these new type finance applications that can exist with these new like finance based tech stacks?
Yeah, man. Every time I talk to developers, like the smart contract seems to be like where the fun is at too. So I want to get back into XCC. I want to talk about, like the trade finance. You guys just had a 6 year anniversary, but I do want to make sure we touch pretty deep on this subject because I want to get talk to someone like actually in the trenches of developing and ask them their opinion about. Have you looked into this new bill that just came out with the stable coins? Can you touch on the stablecoin bill and what you think it means for crypto? I've been hearing people say it's basically like the iPhone moment of money. Also, I've been seeing like people like Uber are looking into how to like include stablecoins into their product. Like, what do you think the stablecoin bill, like stablecoins becoming like basically official, is going to do to crypto markets for people like yourself? Like,
Yeah, so stable coins are like the foundation for liquidity. So here's sort of like the you're sort of stuck in this weird like duality in a sense when trying to bring people onto blockchain technology. You have the benefits of the technology, which everybody loves to go on about, and all the benefits and perks that come with that. But then you have the components of sort of like this free trade, like this internet-based free trade. Now, the technology component's amazing. You get all the benefits right off the bat. But then there's this free trade component of how do you engage and trade with people? Now, stable coins are essentially like the lubricant for that. Now, I say that because traditionally, and when I say traditionally, I mean like literally maybe like 10 years ago, 9 years ago, people would look at the native cryptocurrencies role in this. And obviously, just due to the volatility, it's just hard to be able to find sustainable trade outside of the speculation. But with the stable coins and more stable coins being able to come on chain, I think we're able to see a level of sustainable trade build upon itself long term that we wouldn't be able to see in prior. And just being able to see these stablecoin bills come into play, one helps initiate the legitimacy of stablecoins on chain, but also allows for a mechanism for people to engage in all the benefits of the software, right? So now with smart contracts, you can get into, like I said, collateralized lending, or you can get into like automated conditions on different loans, or you can start getting into all these different benefits that technically have always been there, but because people haven't had sufficient stablecoin liquidity or clarity around stablecoins, you haven't necessarily seen people engage in those type of markets. And I say this because this is sort of like in contrast to the retail base. I don't even know how to describe it. It's almost like these, in contrast to these retail base, crypto base DeFi markets, we're going to start seeing these stablecoin base, tokenization based DeFi markets where there's stable coins and tokenized assets in these marketplaces versus just the native cryptocurrency and really coins, what we see a lot now. But the thing is it doesn't mean, because people always hear this and they go, oh no, does that mean there's no use for cryptocurrency? They don't need XDC. They don't need XRP. No, what ends up happening is the cryptocurrency ends up being liquidity of last resort. So let's say you had a liquidity pair between $1 million in a stable coin and $1 million in a stock, right? And let's say there's a total of $20 million of liquidity of the stock, but only $1 million of liquidity of the stable coin. You may only be able to find so much liquidity, $1 million worth of liquidity, to get into that stock via the stable coin, but you may be able to find better liquidity through the native cryptocurrency to get into whether it's the stable coin or the stock again. So let's say you were trying to get out of some other random asset, right? Now, normally you can get out of that asset into the stable coin and then back into another asset. But if you don't have enough liquidity between those, you could use the native cryptocurrency to be able to facilitate that liquidity. So you end up having the cryptocurrency act as like this liquidity of last resort for liquidity pairs. Because, and I only say that because you can always use that as a liquidity pair. It's just that you're going to have a little bit of volatility that a lot of institutions really don't like. But so they'll try to make their own liquidity pairs with stable coins. But like I said, in order for stable coins to have enough liquidity, you have to list more stable coins. If there's a shortage in liquidity for the cryptocurrency, the price of the cryptocurrency goes up, and that just allows for there to be more capital, for there to be more liquidity. So I think what's
Right.
going to end up happening is now, as there's going to be more liquidity pairs between the stable coins and these more tokenized assets, you'll see more trade, but also you'll see the cryptocurrency, the native cryptocurrency, act as like this, like I said, liquidity of last resort when there's not enough liquidity between the stable coins to be able to provide the trade between these assets that are being listed.
Wow. I never even thought about it like that. That's crazy. That's definitely cool.
Yeah, right. I have these conversations all day, every day, whether it's with new businesses into tokenization, whether it's with private equity trying to be able to figure out what they can do with stable coins and what type of returns they can have. These are really, and I say this because it's one thing to have the finance conversation, but these finance guys don't understand the technology. So it's one thing to have this hypothetical conversation about a hypothetical yield and a hypothetical context, but then they're like, okay, how do the nodes work? How does staking work? How do the yields work? You have to go into the contract, go into the network, and sort of explain that. So I have these conversations every day, and what I see a lot is software developers will get focused, and I used to do this too. Don't get me wrong. They'll get focused on all the capabilities of the technology, but then don't focus on the dynamics of how people not only use the technology but trade with each other with the technology. And I say that because before I would have thought, oh, you could use the cryptocurrency, da, da, da. And then now that I talk to a lot of businesses, it's not that they don't trust crypto, they're very much scared of any volatility at all. Anything that could be just anything. And crypto is just nothing but volatility. Now, don't get me wrong, a moment of volatility is not going to kill them. But like I said, they're not going to opt into that as their first choice. And just seeing barriers come down, whether it's liquidity and stable coins, whether it's new applications coming on chain to tokenize assets to engage in that stablecoin liquidity, whether it's new clients coming on to these new marketplaces, so there's liquidity to trade with people. At a certain point, there's a blend between the software that's capable and the type of practices you're trying to engage in a marketplace with these software. And it's a little difficult at first. There's a little bit of a barrier to entry, mostly because you have to get them situated with crypto, wallet, all that stuff, right? The classic. But what ends up happening is that's like the biggest barrier. Once they're sort of in the ecosystem, especially with stablecoins, right? Because who wants to hold, let's say, $1 million worth of crypto versus $1 million worth of stablecoin, especially through a business lens? Now, once they're in the ecosystems, their ability to engage in the ecosystem becomes a lot easier once they pass that barrier. So
Right.
just sort of seeing how just the barriers that are in play, but not necessarily just focusing on that, just trying to focus on once enough of the barriers have been lowered and enough people can engage with each other with enough units of units of value to engage with, whether it's the cryptocurrency, tokenized assets, stable coins, whatever, that engagement becomes, I think, sort of like the primary component to what makes sort of the crypto space like so efficient, so big. Because once they're in the space, they sort of don't want to leave, right? The yields are pretty amazing. The fees are really amazing. Like, you're sort of in this really amazing space now. It's just getting them in there.
Well, let me ask you this. So, is that why? Because I've been studying like the tokenization of RWAs, real world assets, for a long time, but like you don't really see much RWAs actually on chain, like on dexes and stuff. Like now that we see it, like is the stablecoin bill basically like the precursor for like institutions to finally start doing it? Because then they could pair it with something stable like a USDC versus volatile crypto. Like, is this like the moment we've been waiting for the tokenization space? Do you think?
This is exactly the moment we've been waiting for. The thing that I think, and I'm kind of glad that you put it that way. I think the thing that sort of ends up coming is how, like, so what ends up happening is you can't have a environment of trade if people don't necessarily trust the trade medium. And it's not that people don't trust crypto, especially these institutes. Remember, it's all about that volatility. So being able to have the stability of the stable coins, and it's funny too. The problem isn't even tokenizing. Tokenizing is actually a relatively easy process. It's distribution and liquidity, right? How do you get those tokens into people's wallets or onto those exchanges? And what liquidity pairs can people trade with them to get them on there? So, and even then, getting them on the wallets is already hard enough. Getting them on the exchanges are hard enough. Being able to have the liquidity pairs and stable coins creates an environment that's stable enough to allow for traditional institutions to get into the space. And I say that because now they can start looking at their yields in stablecoin versus their yields in some crypto asset. They can start looking at their yields, or they can start looking at the money lent out in stablecoins, as opposed to, oh, I'm going to go to this DeFi lending exchange and lend out 2 ETH, right? At the peak of the bull market or something, right? Like, it's just like, oh man, how do you go about this? So being able to utilize stablecoins in these DeFi environments it really is the precursor. It really is the thing that is going to spur the environment or create the environment for the tokens that can be tokenized to actually be traded. And I say that because for the past year or so, tokenization, I've seen tons of projects talk about tokenization, whether it's SPVs and private equity, whether it's it's actually kind of funny, whether it's trying to fractionalize different assets. Like these could be buildings, these could be electrical plants. I see so many different projects go about this. Like I said, whether it's fractionalization or tokenization or whatever. But then once you have the token, with what liquidity, right? And then they don't want to accept the crypto asset because they can accept a crypto asset and it takes a dump, and now they're down 6% on a particular thing that they may have been providing. The stable coins just provide a stability to that. So everything, all the benefits of DeFi get to stay. All the lending, all the liquidity, all the dexes, all that gets to stay. But now we get the benefit of stability and pricing with the stable coins, and now with new type of assets like tokenization and real world assets. Those stable coins can now act as like the basis for new markets. And like I said, as there's further demand for liquidity, I think actually this is going to be something really interesting with crypto. In traditional markets, as there's more demand for capital or more demand for cash, right? The interest rates may go up because people are demanding capital like now. With crypto, it may just be the price of the crypto goes up, and now you have that capital to be able to engage in the market. So it's sort of interesting to see that like fiat markets end up having interest rates go up when the demand for capital is high, or the demand for cash is high, or the demand for the liquidity is high. But in these crypto spaces, it could just be demand for the cryptocurrency, and that essentially is like the basis for pricing. And it sort of goes into, like, I was reading this book, like The Value of Money, sort of like marginal utility and like the foundational value proposition of the trade medium itself. And I think it's just really interesting to see like what can be had with these networks, presuming people are able to trade on them to the fullest extent.
Well, man, yeah, I think I seen you make a post about the like the meaning of money thing. So yeah, man, it's definitely. So what do you predict in like the blockchain space with tokenization? I know this guy right here is saying like 27 trillion is going to be coming to the blockchain. Do you think that's actually possible? Like, do you see like a tidal wave of liquidity come into these networks in the next 10 years? And another question I think that just popped in my head, like, do you think it's going to be like one blockchain that rules them all, or do you think there's going to be like multiple winners? Like, how do you like forecast the next 10 years with the stable coins, tokenization, everything coming?
Yeah, so I think blockchains will be domain specific or almost like industry specific. So we talk about this a lot, at least at XDC, where the type of behaviors that are being facilitated on different networks. So you may go to Ethereum for retail consumer based assets. You may go to VeChain for supply chain. You may go to XRP for cross border remittance. You may go to XDC for fractionalization and lending. I think each network is going to have a specific niche that's going to facilitate the type of activity that's going to be unique to that network. And I say that because when it comes to the technology, all the networks are relatively similar, but it comes down to how do people engage with each other on the networks, and what type of applications are being built to facilitate that. I say like VeChain and supply chain because VeChain has been relatively known for their supply chain applications. But a supply chain application isn't just one application. You may have one application that does a tracking of a particular good. You may have another application that does a verification. You may have another application that is more of like an exchange between different tracks of goods or whatever. But what's going to happen is only on that network are you going to have that sort of consortium of applications be able to engage with each other for supply chain, right? So let's say it was XDC, for instance. You want to engage in trade finance. Well, ideally, there'd be a particular type of trade finance activity that's unique to XDC that isn't on particular other networks. So on XRP, you might focus on cross-border remittance. If you want to focus on being able to send money across the world, with remittance, you can focus on XRP. If you want to focus on fractionalization, tokenization, and lending, you might do that on an XDC. And then basically focus the different networks on the different activities you're sort of putting together. And I almost put this together as a the analogy I like to use is like a party, right? You could say, oh, we're going to a party tonight. They're all the same, but you could have a black tie event. You could have a pool party. You could have sort of like a block party type of an event. You could have sort of like I don't want to say black tie event again, but it's sort of like a ball in a sense. There are different ways you can go about sort of doing the same sort of thing. You could have a celebration with a bunch of drinks and a bunch of people coming together. But how are people engaging with each other? Are we chilling by the pool, all catching a tan, all chilling, hanging out? Or are we all, sipping around on champagne, eating hors d'oeuvres, talking about, I don't know, the theater or something? I don't know how to describe it. But the main thing is there's a different type of behavior that you're going to. And that's the thing that you really need to emphasize when it comes to the crypto networks. And then as for sort of like the future of like tokenization or the future of sort of the crypto space, I think there's two things we need to focus on. One, let's call it realized tokenization. And realized tokenization could be any sort of thing that you can sort of name off the top of your head, or any sort of thing that you can name in the traditional finance markets that can just be translated over to a token. Stocks, bonds, equities, securities, debt, anything that you can basically pull from the traditional finance space. We could call these like realized, what did I call it? Realized, what was the term I just used?
Shoot, man, I went blank.
It's okay. Um, ah, Anywho, let's go realized tokenization, right? Let's just call this realized tokenization. Unrealized tokenization, or whatever, I hope I said that right, is all the abstract things that haven't been assigned an asset or token or any sort of accounting value, but they exist, right? And a good example of this could be rewards points. I think we were on stage about this when we were talking about rewards points, where literally you could have McDonald's, right? You go to McDonald's or whatever and eat a bunch, and you have $20 in rewards points. And let's say you're just not going to McDonald's as much as you'd like to, or let's say you'd like to use that $20 at Starbucks, right? Being able to find liquidity, being able to redeem the $20 worth of McDonald's rewards points for maybe $15 or $16 worth of Starbucks points, and then being able to realize that, or being able to exercise that. That is all a lot of unrealized value. It's value because you can exercise it, but it's unrealized, and especially in a way that's different than the traditional way, because it's hard to categorize this value, right? I can categorize a stock, I can categorize a bond, I can categorize, and I can find a way to be able to push this into a market and liquidate it. Rewards points, it's so weird because they're all very abstract. They become very abstract. So it could be rewards points. It could be a free whatever for X amount of thing, a criteria hit for a free thing. It could be any amount of abstract value that can be allocated to a particular activity or good. And usually this is based off participation. So, rewards points is based off you going there a bunch, getting a free drink or a free meal at a place, maybe based off your participation or whatever. There's a means of being able to find liquidity in the things you're able to realize from that participation. So this could be liquidating rewards points for cash and being able to exchange that for cash, or for another type of unrealized value. Now, I say this because it's easy to point at the realized tokenization, the realized value, and say, oh, yeah, we're probably going to hit like 20, 30, 40 trillion. We'll just say that, right? But I'll even say with the unrealized, these unrealized assets and unrealized like tokens, it could very easily be 2, 3, 4 times as much. And I say that because that includes the carbon credits, the electrical credits, that includes every abstract form of value in any capacity, AWS credits or credits you may have in an account. Any amount of abstract value can now be unlocked and now be added as further liquidity to these marketplaces. And it's hard to envision it that way. And I say this because it could be something as simple as, oh, it may be cheaper for me to run on AWS if I buy these AWS credits on the secondary market than it is for me to pay directly AWS, because there's a discount of like 2%. And if I buy a shit ton of these, I'm able to save thousands of dollars because I spend so much on AWS. It's like that in a sense, but there's no liquidity. So if somebody had, so much in AWS credits, they can get liquidity out of that. If somebody had so much money in McDonald's rewards points, they couldn't get liquidity out of that. If somebody had a free drink in something, they couldn't get liquidity out of that. So there are all these things that are valuable that can be tokenized, that can very much be exchanged and find liquidity, that aren't necessarily being calculated in any capacity in today's numbers.
We talked about this. We talked about this a little bit at XRP Vegas, and I was saying that the next generation gonna be able to tokenize value that we're not even able to imagine or comprehend yet. Are you on the same page? We haven't really even tokenize Apple and Tesla stocks. That's easy to imagine, but the younger generation, I think Gen Z is gonna be hey, let's tokenize things that I can't even think of. Are you on the same page? So that's basically what you're saying.
Trying to imagine imagine Facebook was imagine going back in time and Facebook was just launched, and then people are like, oh, you can make friends with people, and then imagine floating the idea of making video content, making money from that, and then being bigger than CNN, and they just go what? by being like by making videos on Facebook on the internet, like
Right.
what? But like that idea would be that idea is so normalized now. We're now on the internet doing that exact thing. But like at
Yeah.
the time, it's just like that would have been a foreign. They just now made friends on the internet, never let alone monetization or advertising or influencers or it's almost like that in a sense with tokenization. There's almost like that influencer media component of tokenization of all those components of value. I only say that because no one would have ever thought that people could be on the internet making money from advertisements and be competing, like I said, with like CNN or competing with like major organizations for views just because they're popular online. And who knows what tokenization is going to bring? I think we see a little bit now with what's the like crowdsourcing. So you see people sort of like tokenize like crowdsourcing for projects, or did you see the whole like tokenize the Constitution or whatever, and they were gonna like do this thing. There are these initiatives people are tokenizing, and it seems a little silly at first. But here's the thing: you can very much fund an initiative by being able to tokenize it, being able to share these tokens, and being able to allow people to own equity in the initiative. And we may not even know what the next wave of influencers or whatever we want to call it is, but it may be sort of in that same vein.
Wow. Wow, man, that's definitely. I remember when I first heard about Twitter, my grandma was like, "That's so dumb." People just post their thoughts on X, and now look at on Twitter. And now look at it. Like it's totally transformed to something that we didn't even comprehend. So, yeah, I definitely think tokenization is gonna follow the same as like the internet did. It's gonna be crazy, and I'm so excited that we're here. Like, this is something that our generation can actually be early on and like pioneer, and actually potentially also like if we're lucky, choose the right plays could really change our life. So we do got to wrap this up shortly. So I did want to go into XDC because I used to be really deep into researching XDC. Haven't been following along so much, and I've seen that you guys just had your 6th year anniversary. So that's pretty big time. They're saying that like it's the RWA, like everything we're talking about, tokenization of real world asset, specialized blockchain, and trade finance blockchain. Uh, with since you've been there, like what have you seen? Like how is the network progressing? Like what's important for us to know? Like any XDC holders out there, why should we be excited about holding our bags and believing in this network and the future of it?
Yeah, yeah. So one of the biggest things, especially over the course of these past 6 years, I've been part of the network for basically 4 years now, and one of the biggest sort of pivots I've seen that's in my opinion really exciting is before we would sort of focus on these independent hackathons, independent startups, these independent developers, and try to bring them onto our network. And obviously, at the time, the space was also like sort of maturing. So you would just see these Solidity developers sort of like hopping from network to network, and we try to find them and try to work with their projects and try to allow them to be able to onboard XDC and all these different things. And at the time, it worked out quite well at the time, but we wanted to be able to scale our efforts. So in this past year, we've opened up a program called the Plug and Play Accelerator, and instead of folks like myself and some of my other coworkers, instead of us going out to hackathons and directly going to these individual projects and trying to get them onto XDC, we've sort of streamlined the process into this accelerator where a bunch of projects will all apply for this accelerator. And over the course of a couple months, sort of like go through sort of like a series of trials in terms of like seeing where the project is, where it could be going, where it could be growing. And then sort of at the end, the projects that are selected, they'll get funding, will sort of get pushed on and essentially get integrated into the ecosystem. This is being supported with resources by projects that are prominent in the ecosystem, funding, additional rounds of funding, and how they're going to deal with their runway and all of that, and guidance and stuff, whether it's from the foundation or from Zinfin. So now, instead of sort of like trying to approach projects individually, we have these new cohorts coming out each quarter of a whole new sort of like freshly funded projects that are coming into the space to allow for a whole new wave of tokenization and RWA-based applications. And I say this because before we would sort of try to advocate for the type of applications that they built. Now we sort of have streamlined for all the applications coming into this accelerator are sort of focused on these initiatives, RWAs, lending, exchanging, stuff like this, and tokenization, as well as getting into our subnets and being able to spin off essentially private layer ones for these enterprises, or sort of like these enterprise chains, and allowing them to be able to tokenize assets on those chains and then push those chains to the main network. I always tell people the cool thing about sort of what's coming on next is we're going to start seeing enterprises set up these enterprise subnets, these enterprise chains. They'll tokenize assets on those enterprise chains, and they just almost act as like a layer two, in a sense, like a private layer two. But they act as these enterprise chains, and then they'll move the assets from the enterprise chain to the main chain, and then engage in wholesale trade with other brokers on the main chain while maintaining their assets on the private chain. So
Wow.
you end up, for them, they end up getting a lot of privacy involved. They do a lot more accounting than just trade. So they can do a lot of internal accounting. They can manage a lot of other things than just the assets that they're trading with in the private chain. But being able to push it to the main chain and trade it on a DEX, or being able to lend against it, or being able to collateralize it, this is sort of the way that we're going to bring forward in terms of tokenization. So being able to have the technology, being able to have the ecosystem, and then sort of the pipeline to be able to funnel these applications into this ecosystem and utilize the technology well is really the thing that we're focusing on now. And it's been coming along really well. We just finished
Wow.
the first cohort. We'll be starting up the next cohort. And every quarter, we'll be having really between 5 and 10 projects that are really either getting funded or really getting put through the ecosystem through this program.
Will any of these projects have like their own token, like a DeFi token on XDC that you'll be able to trade
Some
for?
of them
Some of them,
do.
some of them.
Some of them have their own token. A lot of them are focused on providing platforms for their clientele. So they'll provide like a tokenization platform. I believe InvestaX is like this, or even Polytrade might be like this. Well, they'll provide a tokenization platform. So they don't provide a token, but make it very easy for institutions to go on there and start making and delivering tokens
Right.
to the chain. So they sort of build these platforms that make it easy for people or different institutions to settle and issue their tokens. So if they're not
Nice.
putting a token themselves, they're usually building a platform that makes it easier for people.
Well, that's probably better for XDC, the token, then, probably long term. So we only got a couple minutes left. I think you froze up. Hello? Let me see. Your voice went out. There we go.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah.
All right, we had a little bit of technical
Okay.
difficulties. We are back. I want to
All
ask
right.
you one more thing before we close out this conversation. So what can you describe quickly like what trade finance is and like why it's going to be a big thing for blockchain and how XDC is like positioned well for this market?
I'm glad you brought that up. That is such an amazing question. People don't really emphasize it enough. So really, trade finance is the relationship that a bunch of different participants may have in terms of the type of trade they want to engage in. It could be from direct trade, from I want to trade this asset with you, to lending assets, to collateralizing assets, to trading on top of the lended or collateralized assets, or trending on top or lending on top of the collateralized or lent or whatever it may be. Whatever it's essentially facilitating an ecosystem of trade of sophisticated trade instruments. So when we talk about trade finance, we're talking about a collection of different instruments coming together to create this economy in a sense. So this could go all the way down from tokenization of identities, tokenization of documents for verification purposes, all the way to managing basic facets of the supply chain, all the way down to being able to tokenize and lend or tokenize and collateralize different assets, and then being able to engage in your different trade partners in that capacity. We sort of emphasize the elements of trade finance because it's not quite one thing. But the biggest thing that is sort of that we really like to emphasize is the collection of different resources that we're trying to provide allows for an ecosystem where these different brokers and different trade organizations can now engage in analogous trade that they would in sort of the Web 2 world now in this Web3 world. So when we talk about trade finance, it's like this collection of all these different instruments sort of all coming together on a platform for people to be able to have this ecosystem to engage in trade. And I say this because, like I said, one day we could be talking about lending, the next day we could be talking about verification, another day we could be talking about documentation and how we can make sure we have the correct documents. Another day we could be talking about supply chains, and maybe it's not even the full supply chain. It's just keeping track of a particular document or a particular good between three parties or something, and each party has a conditional contract on top of that. All these different things goes into trade finance. So being able to try to facilitate this ecosystem and this rapidly sort of evolving and rapidly complexing system is sort of one of the main things you try to focus on XDC. And sort of the thing that I was sort of talking about before with the networks, the technology is analogous to a lot of other technologies. So when we try to facilitate trade finance, we are really trying to find, hey, this person over here provides this service in this capacity. This service is needed between these two partners over here so they can facilitate this service, right? So like this could be an underwriter, this could be, there's usually a collection of different trade partners that need to come together to facilitate a transaction. So being able to provide being able to bring as many of them together and being able to provide as much liquidity in this environment for them to be able to trade with each other in the multitude of different ways that they like to trade with each other really facilitates the trade finance ecosystem. And really it's just sort of like a cross between the verification of documents, the tokenization of assets and the exchange of those assets, and then the management of the lending and collateralization of the assets that are tokenized.
Wow. Well, man, I learned a lot in this conversation with you, so thanks for giving us the time. I think we went almost a full hour. We weren't planning on going this long, but we could talk all day, man. So
Yeah, right.
this is a good conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I'm sure the audience learned a lot, and it seems like there's a lot in the pipeline for XDC, and it's really positioned well for this. Especially what you're saying those layer twos with the enterprises using them. Like, seems like it's positioned very, very well. So, for everybody that enjoyed this conversation. Make sure to follow Quincy on X, Coin Club Quincy. Give him a follow. He posts great insights, and you always learn from his post. And any last words before we close this out?
I just really wanted to thank you having me on, especially on your show. Definitely cool seeing you again and being able to chat again. It's kind of I feel like it's a little bit more like casual now. We get to kind of hang out a bit. So
Yeah, you saw me
definitely wanted to chat.
backstage. That was my first talk. I was like sweating. I was like, dude, what are you gonna ask me? I'm worried about my talk.
It was
That was
good.
stressful for me, but it was awesome,
No,
man. We killed it. We had one of the best panels, I think.
it was pretty
People were
awesome.
pretty pretty pumped up for our panel. It was pretty fun.
It was good. It was good. And
The after
honestly, I
party
really
was sick too.
yeah. I wish I could have stayed a little bit longer. I lost you, but kind of got swarmed a little bit. And I'm just running around. So that was
Yeah.
honestly the Sigma party was definitely kind of crazy.
Yeah, that was crazy, man. Yeah, well, let's talk offline because yeah, I'd be definitely want to talk to you if there's ever going to be like an XDC bridge that's like compatible with XRP with for like token bridges and stuff like that. But I got a meeting I got to catch right now, so I got to bounce right now. But I'll hit you up in the DMs, bro.
All right, no problem. Really appreciate it, man.
All right, man. Have a great day.
You too.